Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you are all feeling like wellness warriors today. I am excited to be here. So if you are just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a girlfriend, a grad student studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. Not a counselor yet. Important disclaimer. And I am also a runner, a jazzerciser. I work for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, local affiliate, and I just try to probably do too much in one day, but as much as possible to be an advocate for wellness. And I started Wellness Wednesday because I have been in a lifelong journey with anxiety and depression, and have found that peer wisdom is really, really key in a lot of things. And what I mean by that is sharing our experiences with each other. Because it's just easier when we know that we're not alone and we know that we have other people who have walked on a similar path. Now, all paths are not the same. We know that. In any case, I have found that, when I felt a call on my heart to start this series, it was to share my experiences, and my learning, over time and through college, in hopes that at some point somebody else would hear something that would click for them and help them to make a positive change. So, and sometimes it does, and I never even know. And some other times people let me know, and that's wonderful too. So if you're here, let me know you're here. And if you don't see this till afterwards, hit hashtag replay in the comments, ask a question, drop a comment, respond to the challenge, whatever the case may be. We do try to keep it politics free here because there's enough negativity there for everybody. In any case, if you have been following me on a regular basis, then you probably saw last week's video on psyching ourselves out, which was kind of was an unofficial sequel to the previous week's episode on assumptions. And my challenge was to start an evidence file. And by evidence file, I mean a file, whether it's written, whether it's, hey, Miss Beverly, whether it's written, whether it's digital, whatever the case may be, to start a file of things that you're capable of, an evidence file that you can go back to when you're experiencing self-doubt, or making assumptions about what you think can and can't do or will and won't go wrong, whatever the case may be there, to start an evidence file that you can go back and look at, and prove to yourself that you are capable, and that you have been here before and been successful, or something similar and been successful. So I think I've come to believe that evidence files are really important, especially for those of us that get in that cycle of self-doubt, and questioning. So, 2 years ago, actually today I want to know, what are you feeding the mind that has to carry all of these things? We've been talking a lot about stress, pressure, and overthinking. So what are you feeding the brain that has to carry all of that? When we hear the words feed yourself, we usually think food, but we are much more than a stomach. So there's much more to that. And so I did an episode 2 years ago that was based off of a short speech that I delivered to some teenagers, who were in a skill building class. Yay, I'm so glad you started an evidence file, Beverly. I'm so proud of you. Thank you for sharing that. Also, I forgot to say, if you're here, let me know you're here. But Facebook doesn't always show me all the things. So if you ask a question or you leave a comment and I don't acknowledge you, it's just because I didn't see it, and I will afterwards. Beverly, I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad to hear that you started an evidence file. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how that helps you. All right. So 2 years ago, I gave a short speech to kids between the ages of 12 and 17 that were in a skill building class. And about a week later, I took that speech and I adapted it to a brief Wellness Wednesday episode. And today, or for the next 3 weeks, I decided to do, it's been on me to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into that. So we're going to do a mini series, and it's going to be a 3-part mini series about feeding yourself. Again, not necessarily food related, although that will come into play. Feeding your brain, feeding your body. And then the third part will be feeding your heart and soul. So this week we're going to begin with your control center. That's the brain. And I just want to say that evidence suggests that lifestyle habits may actually help support long-term brain health and reduce the risk of decline. So we're not just talking about right now. We are talking about going forward. And to be honest, y'all, for me, I understand this intimately in ways that I didn't realize had to do with feeding my brain, in that I get bored and I sometimes get a little bit dumb when I'm not challenged. When I get bored, when I'm not challenged, I get into kind of an automatic, robotic type state, and I miss obvious things and I don't see new opportunities. And that's actually one of the reasons I left my previous job, was because I felt like I was operating through life autonomously with blinders, so that I didn't see new opportunities that were beneficial for the organization I worked for, because I was so burnt out and I was bored and I was just in autopilot all of the time. And so things like going to grad school, that's huge for me, because as much as it gets me inside my own head sometimes, it also gives me a constant new mental stimulus, which is really, really necessary for me. I often said when it came to relationships that it wasn't the best looking guy that was going to win. It was the guy that stimulated me. It was whoever was going to stimulate me the most mentally, because after 5 minutes, all the good looks and all the other stuff kind of wears off. And then what do you have left? So, and then of course, if you've been following me for a while, you know about the personal lifestyle changes that I made over time. And a lot of those ended up not on purpose, because I didn't know at the time. And what we don't know, we don't know. A lot of those lifestyle changes that I made ended up being as much for my mind, as much for my anxiety, as much for my brain as they were from my body. So those things are really important. So why does this matter? Our brains influence everything. They literally influence everything. They influence our mood, our focus, our memory, our stress response, our decision making, our motivation, and our confidence. We've talked about all of these things over the past few weeks. And as you know, if you've missed any of those episodes, if they're gone from Facebook, because Facebook only keeps them 30 days, they are available on my YouTube channel. No cost free. Just go and follow and subscribe. So our brains influence everything, literally everything. But it's like one of those things that it's like an operating system on a computer. It just kind of runs in the background. We don't give it much thought. And sometimes what we think is a self-discipline problem may actually be a brain overload problem. For example, right now I'm in the process of planning an event, and I find myself going through that rigmarole of self-doubt of I'm not doing enough, I'm not spending enough hours, I should be staying up later working on this. And what it actually is that I'm having brain overload, and I feel like I'm at a deficit somewhere, when the deficit I'm really running at is bandwidth, brain bandwidth. Because I have so many things that are going on in my head, so many tabs open, that sometimes I just kind of freeze. And let me know if you've ever experienced anything like this. Sometimes I just kind of freeze, and I'm not sure what I should be doing or what to do next. And it's because my brain looks like Pigpen. If you know who Pigpen is from Peanuts, and that constant cloud that's over his head, that's what my brain looks like inside, especially when I'm planning an event. Yes, exactly, Beverly. I think a lot of us that seek higher education, if it's not completely goal-oriented, it's because we need to be challenged in some way. Now, I can't read your whole response, so I'll definitely have to check it out later, because I only get like this much of it. But thank you so much for that. Next time it will not be so time-consuming. I will have to read the rest of that later. Okay, so what we think is a discipline problem may not actually be a brain overload problem. We often make it a point to care for our appearance. Look, I'm all showered and blow dried in the whole 9 yards today. We make it a point to care for our appearance. We make it a point to care for our schedules, and our obligations, but we often neglect the organ that's running the show. Okay. So what do we need now when it comes to feeding our brain? We need mental clarity. We need patience. If we want to feel like we're running at optimal capacity, we need mental clarity, patience, emotional regulation, energy, and sharper thinking. What we need long-term, and I think most of you will agree with me, what we need long-term is cognitive health, right? That's a big issue and a big concern nowadays. We need memory support. We need healthy aging, and we need to lower the risk factors that are associated with decline, especially cognitive decline, right? So let's talk about what starves the brain. What starves the brain are things like continuous negative input. And we've talked about a lot of this over time. Continuous negative input, constant stimulation or overstimulation, even if it's good things. Sometimes even good things can be stressful and overstimulating, okay? Kind of like going to Disney World or going to a theme park, and it's awesome and it's everything you've ever dreamed of, but it's also just so much information coming at you from so many different directions. So constant stimulation, even if it's good, chronic stress, isolation. This is a struggle for me because, as I've stated before, I could easily just stay in my house for a week or two on end and never ever leave. Sometimes I have to force myself to leave to get social interaction. But isolation can be very, very negative, and it can have an impact on it can starve our brain, okay? Because we are designed for social interaction. So, chronic stress, isolation. I have to go back through my notes sometimes. No challenges or lack of new information. Beverly and I were just talking about that. I keep losing my spot, y'all. Poor sleep, dehydration, and improper nutrition, but we're going to talk more about that next week. We're not going to dig into that today because next week we're going to talk about feeding your body, which also has to do with feeding your brain. But that's not for today's conversation. And of course, repetitive negative self-talk. Y'all know this is my soapbox. I will get on it. I will get very close and look into your eyes and talk about negative self-talk. So we tend to underfeed our brains intellectually, and we overfeed them with chaos. And so that's what I would equate in this sense when we're thinking about a food analogy. I would equate that chaos with feeding our brains junk, right? So we automatically equate aging with decline, which is not always true, and it doesn't necessarily have to be true. Although science doesn't understand all of the driving factors behind dementia, memory loss, and cognitive decline, it does not always have to be synonymous with getting older. So who knows that 180 or 90-year-old that's sharp as a tack and has more energy, can run circles around us and just keeps going and going and going and is hilarious and still just seems like they're still 40 up here or 30 or whatever age works that way for you. And they're older than almost anyone we know because we've all known somebody like that. About a year, maybe 2 years ago now, time's starting to blur together for me. I think that's part of that aging. There was a woman who had been part of my life for quite some time, and she died when she was, I think, 99 years old. She may have even made it to 100 briefly. Woman was sharp as a tack. She was 5 foot nothing of spitfire, sharp as a tack, and I always thought, gosh, I hope I'm that clear when I get close to her age. So we automatically equate decline with aging, which is not always the case. And then there's neuroplasticity, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this because it's really important, especially in this context. Our brains can continue growing and evolving through our whole lifespan. And I have an interesting article from Psychology Today here that talks about some of the ways to stimulate the release of something known as BDNF, which promotes nerve cell growth and neuroplasticity and behavioral flexibility. Here's the deal. When we're younger, it's even more plastic, but it's still plastic as we get older. And scientists once believed that you just stopped learning or growing at a certain age, and that is totally not the case. Our brains operate a lot like a muscle that we can build. And I'm not sure I remembered to open it this morning, but I have a list of 10 principles of neuroplasticity that's pretty interesting. And if I can find it again, I will drop that link. So, but the highlights of it were use it or lose it, repetition, 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 which you guys know I get behind repetition, salience. And what salience means is if it's something that's meaningful to you, it's more likely to stick. You're more likely to engage. You're more likely, just like this class that I'm in right now. It is interesting to me. So despite the fact that I was feeling intimidated by the syllabus, I am lit up by this class, and that lighting up helped to determine which topic I chose for this first assignment that's due. So, and then of course it talks a little bit about age too. So the one thing it does say about age is not that our brains still can't evolve. And sometimes they can even build pathways around areas that are no longer functioning properly, which is really cool. And if I was any kind of a science nerd, I would already be in that field digging in. But it does mean that as we get older, we still have the ability to do those things and change those things, but it takes a little longer. We have to give ourselves grace, okay? So, with all that said, what actually feeds our brain? What actually feeds our brain is lifelong learning. We can't do that when we're doom scrolling on social media because most of what we see there is modified, not necessarily completely accurate, etc., etc. So lifelong learning means reading. Yes, it can be fantasy, but it's also good to mix in some nonfiction and some autobiographies and whatever. But reading, taking in new information in general, new vocabulary, etc. Taking a class doesn't have to be grad school, y'all. Some of us go big or go home. But you can take a ceramics class. You can take a class that leads to a certification of something, like a personal trainer certification or a life coach certification. You can start a new hobby, something you've always wanted to learn how to do. You can do puzzles, all different kinds, because when I say puzzle, of course, the first thing I think of is, like puzzle pieces. I just don't have that kind of long-term focus. But other puzzles like word searches, crossword puzzles, things that make your brain think. You can build new skills. That applies to almost any of the things I just mentioned and beyond. And basically engage in intellectually stimulating activities. One of the things my daughter just loves, and I say that very sarcastically, is when she was younger and she didn't want to try a new food, and I still do this to her, and she's in her 30s now, I would say, try new things. Okay, now you know why you never are going to see me on karaoke. But that is exactly right. When we expose ourselves to new things and we try new things, we are intellectually stimulating ourselves, and that is super important to keep that brain moving, that organ. And again, it's like a muscle, to keep it building, to keep it flexing, all of those things. So lifelong learning is one of the things that actually feeds our brain, and I would venture even that it's one of the primary things. Moving our bodies. Exercise moves oxygen, including to the brain. Specific exercises where you have to learn new things or learn new moves or force your body to think about doing 2 or 3 things at the same time. Those stimulate the brain. So line dancing, I do a lot of line dancing. I do a lot of jazzercise. Not lately, haven't been able to get there because I've been so busy, but I love jazzercise. I've never tried Zumba, but Zumba's another example. Because then you're not just challenging your body, you're challenging your brain too. And those types of workouts are becoming increasingly more important as we age, and they're becoming increasingly more mainstream. In fact, I am a certified personal trainer. I don't actively use it, but I study for it and keep my continuing education credits up. And there's a lot of talk about ways to incorporate cognitive type things into your physical workout to keep pushing and using that brain. So moving is really important, and exercise has always and a long time been associated with better brain health. Stress management. This is really important. Stress can affect memory, concentration. So if we can limit chaos and we can limit negativity and doom scrolling and news and learn to say no when we feel overloaded, that is a really great way to help alleviate stress. Connection is also really important. We talked about this a little bit before, but it comes directly in balance. I don't know if that's the right word, with stress management. Here's why. We need to connect. We're designed to connect. We need to nurture positive relationships. Notice I put an emphasis on positive, and real conversations, not just texting or emailing, and help in our community. We're going to dig more into this in part 3, where we talk about feeding our heart and soul. Social connection is protective for mental and cognitive wellness. That also means we need to use discernment to know what type of social connection is too much, is appropriate, or is not enough. And y'all, the more studies I see and the more information I see on the impact of screen time and social media and all this technology on being able to hold real conversations, it's huge. So keep in mind that that's part of the limiting chaos. The news, it's great when we get an occasional heartwarming story, but we don't get enough of those, and we get a lot of very negative. So if you must watch the news, I'm not telling you to not be on top of what's going on in the world. I'm telling you to not make it your biggest priority in the day. I'm not telling you. I'm suggesting that you not make it your biggest priority in the day, okay? And that you limit your exposure to it, because that going to bed on that kind of thing can really have an impact on your sleep, on how you wake up, the whole 9 yards. So the next core component here is rest. Since I just mentioned sleep, proper sleep, adequate sleep, quiet time. Sometimes even if we can't sleep, sometimes just a little bit of meditation makes us feel better, or quiet reflection, getting out in nature, taking brain breaks. Y'all, the other day I spent like almost 12 hours straight in front of the screen doing one thing or another. I have to walk away. I walk outside. I look at the birds. I listen to the birds. I get my bird listening app out so I can identify the birds. Sometimes I go move laundry around or go do something that needs to be done in the house, because I have to give my brain a break, because I just get so, so those brain breaks are really important. If you're spending hours and hours in front of a computer, you've got to get up and move around. You have to. You have to go do something that doesn't require all that brain focus to give your poor little brain a break. Journaling, meditating, prayer, whatever works for you, but quiet time that doesn't involve technology, doesn't involve a constant input of information, whatever. Sometimes work can be like that, even without screens. People who work in a medical setting are under a constant barrage of information and stimulation. We got to have those breaks. They're really important. And then, of course, eating. Food is going to come into play here. We're going to talk more about that next week. But did you know that the brain is only 2% of the body, but it uses 20% of our energy? We're going to talk more about that next week, but it's no wonder we feel exhausted. It is no wonder that, and some of us have issues like when we spend all day on a computer or we spend all day peopling, we feel bad when we're exhausted, and somebody who works in a physical labor job is like, you want to talk about exhausted? Here's what I did today. And we feel bad. But the truth is that constant brain use is extremely exhausting. And not for nothing, there are some times where I'm envious of the people that are doing manual labor for a living, because when they walk away from the job at the end of the day, they can see physical evidence of what they've accomplished. And I can't always do that. And I know that if you work regularly at a desk or remotely online like I do, or whatever the case may be, you may experience that same kind of exhaustion. So we'll talk more about the food portion next week. But these habits that I'm talking about here, the lifelong learning, the moving your body, the social connection, the stress management, the rest, and the diet, these habits all build cognitive reserves, which can be protective against words are hard. It's the middle of the week. Neurodegenerative diseases. Yay, I said it right. So, there's some really important information there. And we need to really take a good hard look at how we're feeding our brain and what we're feeding it with, because just like the analogy that who we surround ourselves, we are the sum of the 5 people we surround ourselves with most often, is a similar idea. Our brains are going to operate at the level at which we feed it. And if we feed it junk, we're going to feel junk. I'm not saying we're necessarily going to spew junk, because we're still very smart individuals, but we are going to feel the junk in various ways. We're going to experience brain fog. We're going to tend to experience more brain spin. We're going to struggle with motivation, and we're going to struggle with sleepiness, and we're going to struggle with just general blocks where we just kind of freeze and we're like, what was I doing? Where was I going? What was I supposed to be doing? And that is oftentimes a sign of brain overload, not necessarily that your memory is starting to slip. If it is happening all the time, then it's certainly worth getting checked out. But primarily, the more we feed our brains, the more we reduce the risk. It's not a guaranteed cure-all, y'all, but the more we reduce our risk of experiencing that decline, experiencing that burnout, and experiencing that those frozen moments where we've got brain fog and we just don't know what's supposed to come next. So, my challenge to you this week is to do one thing daily this week to feed your brain. Read something, take a walk, call someone. I don't have my Bible here nearby, but I can tell you that just doing a little bit of Bible reading every single morning towards the beginning of my day, not always first thing, but towards the beginning of my day, has been a complete game changer for me. And it's not like I'm not taking in educational information. Hey, Miss Kayla, I'm wrapping up, but make sure you go back and watch from the beginning because I know you really need some brain food this week. Kayla's got a very stressful week going on. In any case, feed your brain, read, take a walk, call someone, have a real conversation face to face instead of by text, by email. Learn something new, reduce your screen time, sit in prayer or meditation or quiet reflection, and give your brain the break it needs because you are going to need those brain breaks if you want to be efficient and effective and work at what I referred to earlier as optimal operating performance levels, right? So you got to make sure you take those breaks. You got to make sure you feed your brain the right stuff, which is usually not scrolling through social media. Although now that I know that there's a place on Facebook where instead of looking at your regular feed, you can just hit the little people at the bottom and only see what your friends are posting. That's a huge improvement. So if you have to be on social media, just be discerning about what you're consuming. And don't get caught up in the news and then the ensuing comments that sometimes get out of control in there. All right. So that's what I have for you today, and I hope you found this helpful. So again, this is a 3-part mini-series. We are going to talk about feeding your body next week, and then that's going to be followed with feeding your heart and soul. And all of this is going to tie in together, I promise. This concept is actually something I may be building into something bigger, so you're going to have to let me know what you think of it. But again, the challenge, do one thing daily this week to feed your brain. Read, take a walk, get out in nature, call someone, learn something new. All those things. Pick something daily to feed your brain so that you're not feeding it junk constantly. And I will see, and just remember these things. Before I say I will see you next week, remember these things. You feed your body daily, but don't forget your brain. It's a different kind of feeding. Very little of it's related to actual food. And my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes by C.S. Lewis, you are never too old to set a goal or dream a new dream. Set a new goal or dream a new dream. Basically, because of neuroplasticity, we are never too old to change, rewire, or grow our brain, to bypass dead parts that are not working anymore. That is proven over and over again in science, either medically or mindset-wise. I didn't even know you could see my joggers. These are cozy joggers, Beverly. I'll send you some information about them. I know you love the Unwind. The cozy are just a little lighter, a little slicker, a little more pet hair friendly. Okay, so again, remember, feed your body daily, so don't forget your brain. You are never too old to set a new goal or to dream a new dream. We talked brain today. Next week, we're going to talk about feeding our bodies. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, if you found it helpful, please share it. It will be up on YouTube probably within the hour. And then, of course, it's there on demand because Facebook only keeps it for 30 days. In the meantime, I will see you next Wednesday. And I hope that between now and then, you will just be well. Bye.